Hi, I'm Dr. Susan Wilczynski, and I'm going to tell you about, I'm going to provide an overview of your training project for this semester. If you've heard about this course previously from other students, I can tell you that the project changes from semester to semester, and so if you've heard or gotten materials from other people, you should know they may not match what the current expectations are, so you want to be careful about being overly reliant on things you've heard or examples that others may provide you. So part of supervision includes teaching people to implement interventions with a high degree of fidelity, right? And it seems like, well, that shouldn't be that hard, except for really good training is complicated and you have to do a lot of preparation for it. Typically, there are two things that you have. One, you develop a training manual, and this is a training manual that the trainer uses that guides them through the process of how they're going to train the staff. The person has to be qualified, but they should be somebody who's knowledgeable and skilled enough that if you give them a reminder of the literature and you tell them exactly how all the pieces fit together, that within a day or two they'd be ready to deliver the training. So the training manual is a critical component. Another critical component is having training materials that you actually use as your training staff. Now here's a tricky thing I want you to think about. Imagine every bad training you've ever experienced. Either the materials went over your head or you thought they were too boring, they weren't comprehensive enough, they expected you to fill in the blanks. All of the things that can go wrong in training are something that you want to work to avoid. And so part of that involves understanding who your target audience is. As I said, for the training manual, your target audience is a qualified professional, which is often going to be a behavior analyst or somebody who has enough training to be able to answer specific questions about the topic of your training. But your training materials, those have to be geared toward the people you're going to be training. And for the purposes of this class, we're going to be focusing on a population that is probably not all that much like you. Typically, we're talking about people that don't have college degrees, may not have had any college, or if they did, they've only had a little bit of college. They might be economically disadvantaged. Fast food might have been their last job. They aren't studying behavior analysis. They don't get our lingo, our jargon, and sometimes their primary motivation for working is because this is a good paying job. As opposed to this is what they wanted to do for the rest of their life. And so in the training project, you will already be given a full description of the staff. I think you might have to tweak it a little bit, but really very little. And so when you're developing your training materials, you need to make sure that those training materials are of a high quality and reflect the needs of that staff. So for example, let's say we want to focus on high school graduates. High school graduates, on average, have a 5th to 8th grade reading level. You know what that means? It means that the language you use, on average, should be around a 5th to 8th grade level. Does that mean you can't use any jargon? Of course not. Whatever your interventions are, you're going to have to use those terms. But it also means you're going to have to make the language accessible. And that reminds me of one other thing I want to make sure I mention before I go on. Making language accessible is not quote-unquote dumbing things down. It's actually highly offensive and elitist when people use that kind of language. What you're talking about is communicating with people in a way that they can understand what you're saying based on their previous experience. As behavior analysts, this is something that should be obvious to us. But very often, behavior analysts struggle with this just like everybody else in the world. So when I talk about high-quality training, what kind of things am I looking for? I'm looking for that you've covered everything, that it is detailed enough, it's clear and easy to follow, that you have provided examples, and here's an important one, non-examples. I'm not looking for non-examples where everything is wrong. Sometimes I'll see people put forward non-examples where it's like, okay, nobody could ever even make that mistake. A non-example you want to provide is to help these staff members make a fine discrimination between accurate and inaccurate implementation of an intervention. So that means they have to be really close. Anyway, so involving staff training staff involves making sure that they have a high degree of fidelity. That means that they need to be able to implement it accurately with clients. They need to be able to do it in the kind of setting where treatment is going to be provided. So the first part of the training manual is mostly laid out for you. A couple of places where you have to add some information, but that's the big issue of this semester. You'll spend almost the whole semester working on this project, and you might think, well, gosh, I could do it way faster than that. When you see everything that goes into it, you'll realize it's a time-consuming process, and you have to think through each piece. Some parts where you're focusing primarily on the trainer, so that's the training manual, and other parts where you're focusing primarily on the staff, but still making sure that you're getting a high degree of fidelity. So each semester you can expect that the exact interventions may vary. Your instructor is going to form groups and tell you, and you can sign up for which group you're going to be a part of, but they're all going to be function-based interventions. So for example, you might be assigned to a group that has a differential reinforcement procedure and non-contingent reinforcement, but they're both going to be tied to, let's say, escape. So you assume that this is an intervention that you would use when a client's behavior is escape maintained. Another group might focus on attention maintained, and so on and so forth. And so your interventions, whichever you are assigned to, need to be focused on that function. So the function and the two interventions that you're told you need to do for the purpose of this project. All right, I'm going to talk to you more about the nuts and bolts. Each week we're going to cover this in the beginning, but there were just a couple more things as the intro I wanted to make sure that I covered. When you talk about these interventions, these function-based interventions, you'll also want to make sure that it's really clear why I might pick one versus the other. Why would I make that decision to implement differential reinforcement versus non-contingent reinforcement? You also want to include information about how either of these treatments can be fated effectively. So all of those are going to be components of the training manual. And so these are all of the comprehensive things you need to do. The exciting part is these are things that you've been exposed to in other courses. This gives you a chance to see all of the connections between everything you've been learning previously and to see how that's connected to supervision through good quality training. All right, I'll see you again in the next video.